Hello and welcome to our video on the forms of the Middle Ages and Renaissance. We are going to focus mainly on the musical forms found within these two periods. There's going to be four main forms that I'm going to focus on, and if you want to go onto our blackboard, go into the study guide section and pull up the Part 2 study guide. And it looks like this, and you will notice that the four main forms that I'm going to focus on are listed in the beginning part of that study guide. Since we do have a listening section on your quiz on this part, we want to make sure that you know what to listen for. So I'm going to start with the oldest and work our way up to the Renaissance. All right, speaking back in the Middle Ages, we have Gregorian Chant, which is one of the most important forms to develop because really it's what motivated Europeans to start writing down music, to catalog it within the Catholic Church. And of course, it's named after Pope Gregory the First, who we credit with organizing these chants. We're going to see that these chants are based on Jewish chant that existed before Christianity was able to develop its own musical culture. The thing you must understand, if you don't already know this, the Christian church for the first 300 odd years or so was not allowed to practice their faith openly. They were persecuted by the Romans. The stories you may have heard of Christians being fed to lions in the Colosseum and stuff like this, I mean, that really happened. Christianity was seen as a threat to the Roman Empire, and it wasn't until the 4th century that the Roman Empire began to embrace Christianity officially. And once Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, then it was allowed to practice its faith openly without fear of persecution or being put to death or something. So it wasn't until then that they were allowed to develop a musical culture. And with the exception of very few selections, there's not a whole lot of information we have on early Christian music. But since Christianity came out of Judaism, it's safe to assume that the musical culture within Judaism did influence the early Catholic church. And when we say Catholic, it is a church that grew out of the Roman Empire. That's why it's based in Rome. And it was the only real church up until the Protestant Reformation, at least in Western Europe. So when we look at Gregorian chant, it really helps us to understand what ancient Jewish chant was like, and then I'm going to play you an example here in a minute, and you're going to see the similarities between the Jewish chant and the Western European chant, which is called Gregorian chant. You can even see similarities between cultures that didn't really interact much. It's weird, but you can find chants that are very similar in nature in almost every major religion in the world. If you listen to Muslim chant or Buddhist chant, there's various different religions that incorporate some form of chant. And although some of them are stylistically different, they usually consist of voices, just human voices. They usually don't use a lot of instrumentation. The voices are the main thing, which makes sense because you're singing your praises to your deity. But it usually has a kind of smooth and very loose rhythmic flow to it. It's often very difficult to detect the rhythm of it. For instance, you don't have a beat usually in most of these chants, and it gives it this otherworldly kind of improvisatory feel. It almost feels like someone's praying their heart out to God, and they're so full of emotion that they're singing it, and they're kind of making it up on the spot. But I'm going to play you a little bit of this ancient Jewish chant style, and then we're going to see what the example from your textbook, the Alleluia Vidimus Stellum, which is an early Latin chant in the Catholic Church. So take a listen to this. So that's an example of that, and let's play you a little bit of this Alleluia Vita Mustellum. And again, you should see some similarities. Look for the lack of instruments. Look for the type of singing where you sing multiple syllables per. I'm sorry, multiple notes per syllable. Because usually when we sing music, we sing one note per syllable. Like if you sing Mary Had a Lamb. Notice that every syllable gets one note. Mary had a little lamb. Notice I don't sing it kind of in a chant style. If I were to sing multiple notes per syllable, it would sound like Mary had. And you see how it sounds a little more chant like if you do that. So here is the Alleluia Vita Mustellum, and see if you can hear the similarities to the Jewish chant.
Alleluia.
So hopefully you did see some similarities in there. And again, you can study chant from all over the world and see similarities between it, but there's especially a lot of similarities between the ancient Jewish chanting style and the early Christian chanting style because obviously one influenced the other. I mean, Christianity did come out of Judaism, like we said. All right, so a few other things that you should listen for in Gregorian chant is you will notice that we do have the translation here in the English, but the original language is Latin. And we've covered this before, but Latin is the official language of the Catholic Church. And the reason for that is that it grew out of the Roman Empire. And Latin was the one language that you could expect pretty much everybody in the Roman Empire within the lands of the Roman Empire to speak. So it made more sense to use Latin instead of like Greek or Hebrew, which the original Bible was written in. As a matter of fact, they used what was called the Vulgate, which is a Latin translation of the Bible. And so pretty much all of the Catholic music that was recorded in the Middle Ages is going to be in Latin. As a matter of fact, they kept that up until the 1960s, until they had an official decree called uh, the Council of Vatican II, or sometimes just called Vatican II, I think. But that was in the 1960s. They began to lighten up on the whole use of Latin thing. That's one of the revisions they did. Now we're going to see that the Protestants did have a bit of problem with the use of Latin because by the time you get to the 1500s, not too many people are still using Latin. It made sense way back at the fall of Rome to use Latin as the main language, but over time, it's one of the problems with religion in general. Religion, a lot of times, sets up traditions that made sense at the time, but as society progresses and society changes, religions, like many other organizations, they don't like to change things. The word change is a scary word with a lot of established things. So it's not just church. It can deal with business models and stuff like this. This is why companies a lot of times, if they don't adapt, they die out because people resist change. And it took a long time. It took over 1,000 years for the Catholic Church to kind of get the idea that maybe Latin wasn't the best language to use. But you can see why, because human nature is to fight change. All right, so you do have a couple examples of Gregorian chant. I'm going to assume that you listen to these on your own. I want to go over just a few of the attributes that are listed here in your study guide. Um, you have the general description right here. We have what language you can expect them to be in, which in this case is Latin. Notice the texture. This is unique. This is the only form that we will study throughout this entire class that uses a strict monophonic texture. Now, you may listen to the Hildegard of Bingen chant that you have, the one that's has the nun singing, and you may notice there's like a drone like note at the bottom. That that sometimes was the case with some of these. They would give them a drawn note. But notice that the actual structure, and even that is speculation. We're not 100% sure that that's how it is to be performed. So, O successors that you see there, we still classify it as a monophonic texture because there really is just a single melody with no real accompaniment. Now, one of the things that you will notice is that they are sung a cappella. And actually, I just noticed a typo on my study guide. Notice the way I spelled a cappella here. That is terribly wrong. So I'm going to have to go fix that. As a matter of fact, I made a video about the word a cappella. And I'm going to share that video with you now, and you're going to see the correct way to spell a cappella. So I'm kind of embarrassed. It is an older study guide that I have updated over the years. I've just never caught that error until just now. So you guys got to witness me being a little embarrassed there on camera. Yeehaw, that's going to be preserved for my grandchildren to see and laugh at. But we're going to take a look at this video, and I'm going to teach you the correct way to spell a cappella. And if you don't know what a cappella means, you're about to see where we get the definition of it. And it actually is the same place from Gregorian Chant. We get all of this from the Catholic Church because we're going to learn that. Well, you'll see in the video. I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. But I'm going to let the video play. It's a short little video about it's under 2 minutes long. And you're going to see how to properly spell it as well as where we get the word and what the word means. Okay, so that's a video I made specifically on that topic. And so now you know that a cappella, which I have horribly misspelled here, my past self was not as informed about the spelling of that as my current self is. You now know that a cappella means to sing music without instrumental accompaniment, or yeah, that's the basic meaning of it. And so it's sung a cappella by the clergy because, as you saw in the video, the Catholic Church had a fairly strict policy against instruments being used in their worship music. Notice it has a sense of being free of rhythm. A little or no rhythmic notation was included. We're going to see where that's going to change with a form called organum here in a minute. You commonly sing more than one note per syllable. We already established that. And it's mostly stepwise motion, which means, if you recall from, what is it, chapter 5 in part 1, when we talked about melody, we had stepwise and leaps. Stepwise would be going from one note to the note right next to it. So da 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 da. Like that. Leaps would be like, the NBC theme, NBC, NB, you skip over several notes. So that's, you're not going to see a whole lot of leaps like you would in modern day melodies. Most of the chants were stepwise. For the easy, it makes it easier to sing that way. Now, another thing that you will notice about these chants is that they sound a little foreign to us. They don't sound like Western music usually sounds, and that's because we have what are called the church modes. Now, church modes are an approach to scales that we don't have today. Now, actually, the major and minor scales that we use in most of our music today are actually adapted from the church modes. Two of the old church modes, I think it's Ionian and Aeolian, I think. And these church modes have mostly Greek names to them, like Phrygian and Mixolydian and stuff. But I believe the Ionian and Aeolian modes are what we call major and minor modes today. But occasionally, musicians still use these old church modes. But when you listen to some of these chants, and especially music from these periods, you will hear that the melodies sound a little off. They don't sound normal to us because many of them use scales and modes that are older. They're out of date. They're very similar to what you might find in, say, the Middle East and places like that. Like if you listen to an ancient Greek folk song or something, it may use some of these old modes. So the church was using these as well as secular people, but we call them the church modes because we know they exist because the church was writing this music down. Now I'm going to play you some modern, or not necessarily modern day, but more examples of music that uses these church modes that you may or may not be familiar with. I'm going to play you the Simpsons theme song, and if you ever heard the Simpsons theme song before, you notice it sounds a little off. If you pay attention to the melody, most of the melody of The Simpsons is based on an old church mode, and that's why the melodic nature of it sounds a little wacky and off, which is perfect for the Simpsons family because they're wacky and a little bit off. So check this out. Check out the melody of this. So did you hear how some of those notes did sound a little weird and off and everything? And that's because the Simpsons theme song actually uses elements of church modes. Now another one that you may be familiar with is an old shanty that's called "What Would You Do with a Drunken Sailor." I've also heard it called "Way Up and Then She Rises," or whatever the second part of the song is called. But I'm going to play this song, and you've probably heard this before. And notice that this uses a church mode. It uses, I believe, Dorian mode is what it is, and you'll notice that the melody it sounds a little off. It doesn't quite sound like the major scale that we're used to hearing in modern music.
What will we do with the drunken sailor? What will we do with the drunken sailor? What will we do with the drunken sailor early in the morning? Way hey and up she rises, way hey and up she rises, way hey and up she rises early in the morning.
So sometimes, with folk music and sea shanties and stuff like this, you will see them use some of these older modes because it does kind of give it a neat little sound. It sounds a little different. Even the Beatles in the 1960s were not exempt from using this. This is one of my favorite songs by the Beatles called Norwegian Wood. And you will hear that they actually use Mixolydian mode, I believe is the one they use in this song. So listen to how a few of the notes sound a little off. If you're really listening carefully, it does sound a little different.
Should I say she once had me? She's shown me her room, isn't it good? Norwegian Wood.
And you can find other songs that use some of these modes, like Scarborough Fair, if you're familiar with that song. There's little songs here and there that pop up in various periods that still use these church modes, some more than others. But if you do hear these melodies and they sound a little foreign to you, that's why. And you're going to find that a lot in the music of the Middle Ages and Renaissance, because it really isn't until the 1600s with the Baroque period that they began to favor the two modes of major and minor. So by the time you get to late Baroque, especially into the classical period, composers almost exclusively only write in major and minor modes. And most of today's music is exclusive to those two. All right, now the next real important development in a Gregorian chant is something called organum. Now, you may think that organum is something entirely different than chant, but actually it's based on chant, and I consider it an extension of chant, even though you're going to see that the chant kind of gets left in the dust a little bit. Now, what they first started doing was here's the original chant melody where you would sing this bottom line here, and they eventually started adding an upper line to it to give it some kind of sense of harmony. I guess after hundreds of years of singing these chants, they got a little bored with them, so they wanted to spice them up with a little harmony. Now, this is called parallel harmony here, where you are moving your upper line exactly in tandem with the bottom line. Now, eventually, this second line, they began to add extra notes to it. So instead of singing in tandem perfectly, they would like go up here and then they would go down here and back to here, and they would add little basically notes in between the notes. Now, the problem that this created is that if these notes in between, if you didn't line up and come back to this note right here, then you were singing the wrong note. And if you recall in early chant, early Gregorian chant, they didn't notate rhythm very much. So when it came time to do the organum, they had a real problem because they needed to be able to notate rhythm. Because in order for the harmony to work, certain notes had to line up vertically. And if you remember, we notate rhythm on a horizontal axis, but harmony is on a vertical. So the crosshairs have to line up, or else you don't get the right harmony. So this is an example here of some organum. And one of the strict rules with Gregorian chant is Gregorian chant was considered sacred and the rule of law within the Catholic Church. So you couldn't really get rid of the Gregorian chant. That would be seen as sacrilege. So this is the Alleluia section of Gregorian chant. Notice they go Alleluia. Yeah. So they make this basically the bass line. And you can see how many notes they added above it. And so the bass line, you if you didn't know to listen for the Alleluia, listen to how obscure it sounds. The original Gregorian chant is almost completely lost because you're listening to the essentially the main melody of it, which has been composed on top of it. So this way they were able to kill two birds with one stone. A, they were able to preserve the original Gregorian chant by usually making that the bass line, and B, they were able to add metered notes above it. And again, in order for these notes to line up properly, you had to have metered rhythm. So if you see any questions regarding why the School of Notre Dame, where they developed this stuff, the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris was a very important place at the time. And they had a couple of church musicians that really were instrumental in developing this metered rhythm. And this is why organum and the Church of Notre Dame were important in developing this technique, because this is the first real steps towards polyphonic harmony. And if you recall, polyphonic harmony is two or more melodies of equal interest going on at the same time. And this helped establish that style within the church. So listen for the main Gregorian chant melody in the tenor line here, which I referred to it as bass before, but it's practically low enough to be a bass line, but it's actual tenor singing it. And then you will hear what's called the duplum up here, and that is the part that would need to be metered along with the Gregorian chant part. So take a listen to it. So hopefully that gave you enough of a sample there that you could kind of figure out what was going on. Again, you can see how the bottom line, the original Gregorian chant, could be lost a little bit in that. But this became a new practice within the Catholic Church, and it eventually led to the polyphonic style found in the Catholic Church. And they eventually also developed new forms that were a little lighter on the whole idea of that you have to use these Gregorian chants. And so you have some examples in your textbook, and that's going to deal with our next form that we're going to look at, which is the motet. Motets first appeared around the 13th century as organum-like works. The organums are again based more on Gregorian chants. Some motets borrowed parts of Gregorian chants to help give it some credibility, but most of the motets were original compositions. They are still going to be in Latin because they're still within the Catholic Church. We're in the 13th century now. It's not till the 1500s, the 16th century, that the Protestant Reformation begins to brew up. So we're still in a unified Catholic Western Europe, and so the Latin is still the main language. It's polyphonic texture. Notice that's different from the monophonic we had with Gregorian chant. So if you hear polyphonic texture, it's not Gregorian chant. All right, and some post-Counter Reformation motets had more what we call imitative polyphony with brief passages of homophony. So occasional little passages of homophonic texture may exist if it's past the 16th century, because motets for hundreds of years were used by the Catholic Church. Now, for the performance, the things you want to listen for is that it's going to be sung a cappella, and again, daggone it, I misspelled it. So I'll be sure to fix that. It's sung a cappella, and hopefully you've noticed also with the Gregorian chant, it's sung by the clergy. Notice we haven't said anything about the common people singing. Commoners singing in the Catholic Church, that didn't really happen. The Protestants were the ones that encouraged congregational singing, and that had to do with the religious philosophy in Catholicism. Catholics believe to this day that you don't approach God directly. This is why most Catholics, they don't own a Bible. They don't read it themselves because they believe that you have to pray through a priest or a saint or something like that. You don't have direct access to God, and therefore the congregation let the clergy perform most of the sacred rites and stuff like that. So and most people, they were busy working. They didn't have time to study music, and they didn't know how to read music. The idea of having hymnals in the pews was just not a thing. Most people couldn't read or write back then in the Middle Ages. Literacy was pretty much monopolized by the clergy, and so they were the ones that were mostly trained in music. As a matter of fact, up until the 1800s, the idea of musical training meant that you often sent your child to a church for music lessons because, and like we said, Aretha Franklin and artists like this today, many of them learned to sing first in the church. Many artists that are doing pop music today will tell you they learned about music first in their church growing up. So it's going to be mostly clergy, monks, nuns, people that work full time. If you don't know what clergy means, it's a full time dedicated person who is officially sanctioned by the church. All right, and again, this time it would be all Catholics, so we're talking priests, monks, nuns, and people like that. All right. It featured notated rhythms, and that's a huge development because with notated rhythms now we have more accurate notation in music, and it does have a detectable beat to it, so you start hearing that. It usually is going to, like we said, be a cappella. It's not going to have instruments because even up towards the 16th century, instruments were still looked down upon in the Catholic Church. And our example here is the Ave Maria Virgo Serena. So make sure you check that out. That is a religious poem set to music, and you'll notice that's what we have as our definition here. It's a poem about Mother Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Virgo Serena means serene virgin, and so they are celebrating her virtue and her worthiness as the mother of Christ. And so you can follow along with that. You're going to want to pull up the translation, obviously, and from the Latin, so you can understand what they're talking about. But that is an example of the motet in your textbook. So go listen to that if you haven't yet, and listen for all the things that we have gone over here. And with that, we're going to move on now to the Mass. And Mass is a daily ritual. Notice it is a daily thing that the Catholic Church does. Now, the most popular Mass for them to go to is obviously on Sunday, which is the day Christ arose. So most practicing Catholics, they may not attend every single day with church, but the priest is there and he's performing the Mass. So there are five parts that were traditionally sung, and this is not going to be the case if you go into a modern Catholic church because there have been major changes within the Catholic Church. We're mainly talking about what a Mass was like during the Middle Ages and Renaissance. And there are five parts that usually involve chant-like singing, usually based on Gregorian chants or some other sacred music, sacred hymns and stuff like that. And those are the Kyrie, the Gloria, the Sanctus, the Credo, the Agnus Dei, which we've previously gone over. So I have pronunciations here for you. The masses in these time periods are going to be in Latin, and again, that's going to be the case mostly up until the 1960s with Vatican II. They're going to be mostly polyphonic, so there are going to be multiple overlapping melodies, and this is actually going to be one of the criticisms that the Protestants had about the Catholic Church, is that this stuff is in Latin. Most of your congregation by the 16th century doesn't understand this stuff. And even if you could understand the Latin, the polyphonic nature, the overlapping melodies, the lyrics are getting clouded by this. And if you listen to these examples in your textbook, if you listen to like the Agnus Dei that's right here, which is an example of the music of a mass back in the Middle Ages, you are going to hear it's very difficult, even with the lyrics laid out for you and stuff, it's very difficult to follow along in this piece of music because the melodies are overlapping so much. I know what to listen for because I've studied the piece, but even when I listen to it, it's the lyrics get clouded very quickly. And so post Counter Reformation, and the Counter Reformation, I forgot to establish what that was before. The Counter Reformation is what the Catholic Church did when they realized that the Reformation was not going to be squelched out. They realized that Martin Luther and people who had protested and demanded reforms within the Catholic Church, they were not going to be shut up. They were not going to be silenced. And so they eventually had to come to grips with reality and realize that there were problems within their church, and they finally were forced to make some changes. And so this was their attempt to save face. This was their attempt to not fully admit defeat and admit that the reformists were right, but to make some changes. And one of those changes involved music. The Pope actually said, we need to change the music. Although it sounds beautiful and it's this heavily ornamented music, and I understand you want to give God your best and you want to make it sound ornate and beautiful, we got to keep our people in mind. And this is a huge dramatic shift that we see in the culture in Western Europe. You probably read about humanism. And this is where we start putting more emphasis on the humans and human life and the human condition, and it's less about God. So the music's less about offering your best up for God and making the music more accessible to the people. Now the focus is starting to be on the congregation and their needs and what they want. And you still see that trend in music, church music today. Church music's changed a lot in the past 50 years. There's been a huge move away from the hymns because people say, well, hymns are boring, blah, blah, blah. And, you have still that argument alive in Christian churches today here in America where, do we stick with tradition? Do we stick with what we think is holy sounding and what pleases God, or do we please the people in our congregation? Do we try to make it more engaging to them? So whether or not to serve man or to serve God is an ongoing debate. But they believed the Pope sided with the whole idea of we gotta make this stuff more accessible to our congregation. So he demanded that they make some reforms. And so with the mass music in the Renaissance post Reformation, then you're going to see a little lighter polyphony. It's more imitative polyphony where you have imitative lines. And again, you can see that really well represented in the motet here, the Ave Maria. And you can also see it in your second example of the Mass in your textbook, which is not the Agnus Dei. The Agnus Dei is in the Middle Age kind of style. That's the very, very polyphonic example. But Palestrina here with his Pope Marcellus Mass, if you listen to the Kyrie from that, and that's in the Renaissance section, which is chapter 2 and part 2. You will hear that notice that it's imitative polyphony. And there's even parts where the voices come together and they make like a chord, which sounds like homophonic texture. So you can see the move in church music, as well as some of the secular music in the day, more moving towards more imitative, more simpler, that doesn't sound right, more simple polyphony, or at least polyphony that is a little easier to follow, and the lyrics get less clouded by the polyphony. It's still sung a cappella, still don't expect to see instruments. Now, the Protestants didn't have a huge problem with instruments. You see, in the early days, they didn't use a whole lot because many of the early Protestant practices were based on what the Catholics did. That's all they knew. But eventually, you'll see when we get to like the Baroque period, Bach was a Lutheran. He followed the Protestant teachings of Martin Luther, one of the guys we consider to be a leader in the Protestant Reformation. And you'll see he had an entire orchestra, that accompanied his church music. So that's a little later on they add that. But as far as Catholic masses and stuff, modern day Catholic masses may have instruments. It's very common to see instruments nowadays, but in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, do not expect to hear any instruments. It's going to be a cappella. All right, so we also have the notated rhythm, and we can thank organum for that. And the regular Mass, the one that is performed on a calendar basis for every day of the calendar, the Catholics have a certain passage of the Bible they cover and certain concepts that they address and everything. Now, there's the Mass proper also, which if you have a special occasion, as a matter of fact, we get the word Christmas from the Christ Mass, which would often be celebrated on a special occasion to celebrate the coming of Christ. And so the reason we say Christmas is from that. But like if someone important dies, they may write a Requiem Mass, and we'll learn a lot more about the Requiem when we talk about Mozart, because the last thing he ever wrote was a Requiem that's pretty famous. So we'll talk about what Requiems are and how that they are like Masses, but they're a special kind of Mass because they would be performed for a special occasion that's not on the official calendar of the Catholic Church. And we do have, again, two examples. The Notre Dame Mass is more in the Middle Age style. The Pope Marcellus is more the Renaissance style. And even though the Pope Marcellus Mass was not necessarily written in response to the Counter-Reformation, it definitely shows the trend towards the reforms of the Counter-Reformation. All right, so hopefully that made sense. It's hard to cover such vast periods of time and talk about all the many changes that go on in these and do it in a pithy way, so I apologize if it's a little confusing at times. So what we're going to do is we're going to look and see how the modern day music has been actually influenced by the Mass. I'm going to play you a song from the 80s that actually uses the lyrics from part of the Kyrie, which is one of the oldest prayers in Christianity. Kyrie eleison, if you recall from our previous study or reading in your textbook, means it's part of Kyrie eleison. Kyrie eleison is Latinized Greek that means God have mercy. So when people hear this song by Mr. Mister, which came out in the 80s, a lot of times they didn't know, because Kyrie eleison is not English, so they didn't know what he was saying. And I've read where people on the internet have said they thought he was saying carry a laser down the road that I must travel. But he's saying Kyrie eleison, down the road that I must travel. And what he's saying is God have mercy. And the reason that they wrote that lyric in there is I believe the drummer of the band wrote the song, and he was raised in an Episcopalian church, which they use a lot of things. They adopt a lot of the things from the Catholic Church. And so he grew up singing prayers like Kyrie eleison. So see if you recognize this song from the 80s. And even if you haven't, listen for them to sing the Kyrie in the chorus. So that's, modern day influence of, ancient Latin music from the Middle Ages. So occasionally you will see modern day settings of the Mass. When I was in undergrad at Campbell University, we sang in the choral society. We sang a modern day setting of the Mass by, I believe it was John Rutter was the guy's name. And so we sang parts in Latin that were like Gloria and Sanctus and stuff like this, but it was set to modern music. So you still see people write Masses to this day. Even people sometimes who aren't Catholic write Masses, because if I recall correctly, the John Rutter guy, I think he's actually an agnostic or an atheist or something like that. So he's not even Catholic, but he uses the Mass because of its rich tradition in music. These composers having to write these masses and write a lot of them, I mean, it really helped. And they recorded them all because they were official liturgy in a church. And so we have a vast catalogs of being able to study the progress of music because it was written down. All right, so we're going to play you an example of this. This is probably not exactly what it sounded like in the Renaissance, obviously, but this is kind of an example of where Protestant music was going, because after the Protestant Reformation, the Protestants began to reform music, and they very much started gravitating towards homophonic texture, which is a single melody that's supported by the harmony. So the standard harmonization you hear in like a church hymn and most modern day music, that was a development. That's why the Protestant Reformation is so important to music, because they put such a stress on being able to follow the lyrics and understand the lyrics. I believe this one's in German, so you're not going to be able to understand the lyrics unless if you know German. But think if you're a German person sitting in a church, and think about how much easier this is to follow than some of that polyphonic stuff that you heard with the listening in your textbook. And you can hear how that's so much easier to follow because there's just one central melody, usually sung by the soprano line, and then all the other lines are singing the same lyrics in the same basic rhythm, and they're following in line with it, forming homophonic texture. And that's what we expect in most of our music to this day. So, when you're looking at music from the period of the masses, it's very important to establish whether or not you're in the Middle Ages or the Renaissance, which would have some of the influences of the Reformation. It's important to know what to listen for, because it's going to be really hard to distinguish between motets and masses if you're not familiar with some of the lyrics. So you're pretty much going to have to memorize these, because if you hear a song start off and they're singing Kyrie, 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 then you know that that's a mass. And these are going to be the biggest telltale signs, because you notice they're both in Latin. They both are polyphonic. They are both sung a cappella by the clergy. They have very similar attributes. But the main thing is motets are religious poems that do not use the set lyrics, the set liturgy in the Mass. So if you hear them singing Gloria or Sanctus or something like that, that's going to be from a Mass, and it's going to be very important that you listen very carefully to distinguish a Mass from a motet. That's usually where students mess up with these forms. So on the quiz, you will have a little excerpt to listen to, and when you listen to that, you will have to identify the form, and that's usually where students mess up. Like I said, is they'll try to identify a motet as a mass or a mass as a motet, but these 5 words right here are going to be your savior in that. Well, technically it's 6 words because this one's two, but you get what I'm saying. You have to really listen out for those, and that can be hard because I said again with the polyphonic texture, it's sometimes hard to hear what they're singing. But with a little bit of practice, you'll get better at it. Everything can get better with practice. There's no excuse for giving up on your first or second try. All right, and that leads us to the last form that we're going to look at, which is the madrigal, which is the only secular kind of music that I'm really going to focus on. Now, I'm going to play an example of some like Renaissance style secular music, and you can see this is instrumental music. This is not vocal, and you'll notice that a lot of this, if you go to like Renaissance fairs and stuff like this, they'll play this kind of music on instruments that are kind of antiquated, or at least ancestors of the modern day instruments, because again the violin has not even been really established yet. I mean, there are viols and stuff like that that are precursors to the violin, but the modern day violin shape and stuff doesn't really come along until the Baroque period. Modern day, transverse flutes are much later than that. So our modern day instruments didn't exist then, and also notice that they'll be often be playing in those church mode scales. Listen to how foreign this music sounds, despite the fact that it is from early Western culture. It sounds more like Arabic or something like that because some of the scales, the church modes, sound a little more Middle Eastern or Asian. Some of them sound a little bit Asian and stuff because they're not usually based in the major and minor modes that we're used to. So take a listen. And one of the things that you'll notice if you read the section on secular music did not get the respect and dignity that religious music did. So it wasn't written down as much. About the only music in the Middle Ages that was somewhat respected and did get recorded a bit. You had different kinds of secular musicians, and trying to find the section in your textbook here. It deals with this. You had people that were called troubadours that were of noble birth. So these troubadours would be, they were the noble class, usually French, and they were of the privileged elite, and many of them could afford to travel around and sing usually love songs and stuff. I mean, listen to pop music today. Most songs today are about love and heartbreak and really strong emotions like that. And you can go back to the Middle Ages and see where people recorded some of these medieval love songs. That's nothing new to have that. So anyway, we have the troubadours, and they were fairly well respected, and they definitely got a lot more respect than the jongleurs that you see here. Jongleurs were these wandering minstrels, and although they served an important role in medieval society, they actually were like newspapers before people had newspapers because they traveled around. They were traveling musicians, and that's one of the ways that news spread. So, like for instance, when the plague was breaking out in Western Europe, that's one of the ways people heard about it. These jongleurs were going from town to town singing their minstrel songs and telling people about the scary stuff they saw where this disease was coming through. And so, but you will see here that they had no civil rights. They weren't trusted. They were treated on the level of prostitutes and slaves, because they were wandering, traveling people. They were an outsider. They weren't established in the society. And many people, just like rock musicians today, they would come into town. They would sometimes cause trouble. They would woo women and cause jealousy and stuff like that. So they were not deemed very high in society, and so a lot of their music wasn't seen worthy enough to be recorded on expensive paper that used expensive ink. This is one of the reasons why church music is written down so much better than secular music because it had the coffers of the great Catholic Church to fund it, because paper back then cost a lot of money, and so did ink. So you didn't just write down anything, and that's why when you see these pages from these texts back then, they actually treated the pages as a thing that was valuable, and that's why they decorated it so much. So anyway, moving on, let's look at what a madrigal is. A madrigal, they first appeared in Italy during the Renaissance and then later in England. So the two languages you can expect to see them in are Italian and English. And so the English ones are definitely the more popular ones. And you will see that they are mostly polyphonic with some homophonic passages. So they're kind of like motets in that respect. But remember, these are secular. These are not going to be about religion and God and Jesus and stuff like that. Don't expect them to include anything about God or religious matters. They're usually going to be about love or some kind of secular subject. They're sung by two or more people. They often feature word painting, which is when the music reflects the poetic imagery. If you look at your example in your textbook, which is As Vesta Was Descending, you will notice that in your listening outline, if you pull that listening outline up, the italicized words in there are examples of word painting. So, for instance, there's one part where they sing came running down a main, which means come running down the hillside, and you'll notice that they sing very fast notes that are descending. And so you get the imagery of people running down the hillside by singing those words fast and going down in pitch. And there are examples of this in modern day pop music, where, like Garth Brooks sings Friends in Low Places. I've got friends in low places. Like on the word low, he goes to a very low note. So that's an example of where we still do that kind of stuff. So secular, it's not religious. It often tells a story, like many pop songs today tell, little miniature stories. If you want to see a good modern day pop song, and I say modern day, I mean somewhere in the past 100 years or so. Listen to All I Want to Do Is Make Love to You, which is from the 80s, I believe, or early 90s, and it tells a story. And that's not the only example. There's several examples in modern day pop music where they tell stories, but the name of the song makes it sound like, just somebody wants to sleep with someone else, but it actually has a interesting story tied to it. So look up All I Want to Do Is Make Love to You on YouTube and listen to the lyrics, to the story it tells. Sometimes nonsense words like fa la 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 are used, and you can actually see this influenced by some Christmas stuff like deck the halls with boughs of holly, fa la 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 la. That actually comes from the Madrigal tradition, where they would sometimes use nonsense words. So Louis Armstrong and singing scat stuff like that, like shoo bop ba doo bop ba doo bop boo, that's not anything new. They've been doing that in Europe hundreds of years ago. So check out your listening for As Vesta Was Ascending. Make sure you pull up, if you pull up in your smart book, you can pull up your listening guide and follow along in that. Make sure you look at the study guide. Make sure you look over and review these attributes. And with this, you should be adequately prepared to listen to music from this period and kind of get a good idea of what's going on, and usually identify what kind of form it is. You're not going to hear this kind of music played a lot in today's world. You kind of have to hunt around for it, but it's important to know what these pieces were like, because you can literally see the development of Western music in these types of pieces. You can see them go from very simplistic monophonic with no instruments to eventually see instruments come into play, and it start moving towards homophonic. And especially by the time we get to our next period, which is the Baroque period, which I'm going to get you to start studying this week. Especially in the Baroque period, you're going to see music start to sound a lot more like it does today. And you're going to see them shed those old church modes. They're going to kind of, just use the major and the minor modes. You're going to see them get more precise with their rhythmic notation. You're going to see them favor homophonic texture more, although they will still use polyphony and a baroque. And you'll start seeing, it literally progress to the kind of music that we listen to mainly today. So be sure, again, to check out all these various study tools. And the main thing is listen, listen, listen. Listening is just like lifting weights. If you only lift weights once or twice a week, and then you quit, you can't expect to have muscles. So listening is an exercise, and you have to work your ears and really spend some time with these pieces, to have all the things become apparent that I'm going over. In these videos, I have to go over this stuff very quickly, but when you get to sit down and listen to them, you can spend some time with them, you can get to know them better, and some of the stuff will become very apparent the more you listen to it. All right, so happy listening, and we'll see you next time.